Hi everybody, this is lesson 5 in using Honeybee and OpenStudio inside of Grasshopper to do more advanced energy modeling. And today we're going to be talking about airside economizers, and really everything up to this point I think has been pretty easy. This is really the first time where I think it might take a little longer for you to wrap your mind around it. And I'm not going to do every possible combination of things that you could theoretically simulate here. Again, it's just basics, but this is a really important video. If you don't watch or pay attention really to any of the others, I wouldn't say that that's a good thing, but this one's really important. Um, so I guess the way that I think about this, and this isn't the greatest diagram in the world, but this gray box is supposed to be our air handler. And then inside the air handler is this airside economizer. And for people who are familiar with those, that's great. If not, essentially what an airside economizer does is it looks at the outside air conditions and it looks at the air coming back from the zones. And it basically has logic in it to make a decision whether to take more air from the outside or more air from the return. Now, I mean, it's probably going to be most people's guess that it would be more efficient just to always take the air coming back from the room or from the group of rooms. But it turns out that there will be certain periods of the year where it's better to take the air from outside because it's just at the right temperature and the right conditions. And the airside economizer figures that out. um, it turns out that in Energy Plus, there are these kind of overlaid controls on an air handler and on an airside economizer. Um, the ones that I've highlighted in red, you can see they're kind of bounding the different objects that we're talking about. They're called availability managers, and they do what they sound like they do. They manage when a component is available and when it's not. So, you know, you can the right way to think about it is you can tell it, only come on, air handler only come on between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and economizer only come on between those hours. And then there also happens to be another controller called a mechanical ventilation controller that sits um, to you can think of it conceptually sitting here, right? Kind of like not in the economizer and not in the air handler, but sort of controlling when fresh air is available to the economizer and like how much. So it turns out that let's just say this is a typical day, and it turns out that both the mechanical ventilation controller and the availability manager for both the air handler and the economizer, when you start using these components, they're set by default to be like always on. And it turns out, and I'll show you in a second, that's kind of a bad thing. Because really what we typically want is something more like this, where, you know, basically the availability managers will say, hey, you know what, don't make anything available at night, because that's how most buildings work. And you can see here that this is kind of saying they're off. And then, and maybe even on top of that, don't even make the economizer available. So this green line here is the mechanical ventilation controller. Don't let the mechanical ventilation provide any outside air to the economizer until maybe, I don't know, say 8 a.m. when people are starting to actually come into the building. And that can be one of those things that can save you a little bit of energy. And that's great and good, but then you also want a controller that, you know, maybe if a zone's getting too cold or if a zone's getting too hot, you want to be able to override the normal daytime behavior and let the system run at night. So that's what I'm going to try and show you. We're going to try and make the system do that right now. So this is really the same project, except I've added a couple things to it, which I'll kind of walk you through here. And all the components are the same. It might look a little different, and it might be getting a little more crowded now, but all the components are the same. I've kind of spread them out, and what I've done is I've put an Airside Economizer in. And the Airside Economizer is a component which is right here. Yep. And you can see that really I plopped this onto the page and just provided a unique name for it. Everything else on the page, the 2-speed DX coil is still here, the evaporative condenser is still here, and the variable speed or variable volume fan, I should say, is still here, and all of those things that I used in the last lecture to set the pressure. So just to go over the economizer, since that's kind of the point of this lecture, really providing a unique name is the only thing you have to do to get started. All of these others default to pretty good values. The default economizer control type is a fixed dry bulb. You can see here, and that's just looking at the outdoor dry bulb, or the outdoor temperature, basically, and comparing it to the return air temperature. You can also see that you can choose a few other options like differential dry bulb, fixed enthalpy, a bunch of different enthalpy ones, fixed dew point and dry bulb, differential dry bulb and enthalpy, and no economizer. And you can choose any of those, and the system should work just fine. Control action. I rarely set this to anything other than modulate flow, but you could, if you want to see what values you have at your disposal here, you can always come down and look at this. You can do modulate flow or modulate flow, but the bypass is really for a heat recovery device, which is a more advanced topic, and which we'll cover in a different session. I'm just trying to cover this example here. And then for the most part, we typically don't put anything in for the next three. It's pretty rare. Energy Plus has a lot of stuff in there to kind of figure that out for you, but you can limit the minimum or the maximum flow rate going through the thing. And then you can also see there's a minimum limit type, and again the default there is fine. And again we're kind of getting into esoterics here, but if you're familiar with Energy Plus, you'll note again that you can either do a fixed minimum, meaning we'll always go to the same minimum, or we'll do a proportional minimum, which is based upon the current flow rate. You can also provide a maximum outdoor dew point, but you have to choose. If you do that, you have to choose a economizer type 5, see fixed dew point and dry bulb. Otherwise, that value will be ignored. Sensed minimum and sensed maximum. So that really depends on what your control type is. And since the default is a fixed dry bulb, so out of the box, you turn it on, you plug it in, it will be a fixed dry bulb. The sensed minimum means that whenever the outdoor temperature goes to this temperature, the the economizer will essentially take only the minimum outside air that it needs. And the sensed maximum, the same idea. When the outdoor dry bulb gets to its maximum, the economizer will take only as much air as it needs, and it will always take the rest of the air from the return. If you choose a different type of economizer, you're going to have to supply new values here. We don't have a way of letting you specify a new type and then automatically provide new sensed minimums and sensed maximums. So you can see here the Honeybee default is a fixed dry bulb with a minimum of 12 degrees Celsius and a maximum of 22 degrees Celsius. Then you've got economizer lockout. You only really need to use this when you're doing using a DX system, which we are here, and to you can provide a value there, so you can choose 0, 1, or 2. So I don't know, maybe I could try doing that. And everything still looks good. And then you'll see a time of day schedule. But you would think that maybe that's what you would use in order to get this behavior that we're looking for, but it turns out that no, you would really only use this if you're using a very simplified economizer with your own logic. So it's there, but it's very rarely used. And then the last two are your mechanical ventilation controller, which is, as I said, this guy here. And finally, the availability manager list, which is the availability manager for your Airside Economizer. Right? So we're going to be playing really with just these last two in order to try and get the behavior that we want. Okay? So when you're done specifying your economizer, you again take the output here and you plug it into your air handler, your air handler definition. And you'll see that the air handler also has something called an availability schedule, and it also has something called an availability manager. Okay, so it turns out that for this exercise, the availability manager and the availability schedule are kind of like the two most important things to get the behavior that we want. So let's just pretend that we had just started a project, we had pulled the Airside Economizer onto the screen, we had given it a name, a control type, and set it up the way that I described. We plugged it in, and that's all we did. And then we hit run. Let's do that. I'm sorry, this is going to go a little over 15 minutes here, because I need each of these to run so you can see the results. Okay, so I made this little visualization using a JavaScript framework called D3, and you'll see basically a few different visualizations here. This first one's the outdoor dry bulb. So we're using a fixed dry bulb economizer, so this should give us some indication. Um, and the second one is the outdoor air flow rate, and you'll see that it's just one value all the time. So it's definitely not what we want. This third one is the status of the economizer. Um, and you can see that it's sort of all over the map. It seems like it's on a lot at night, and that shouldn't be the case. And then this last one here is the cooling coil operation. So you can see that there's a lot of hours where the cooling coil is on in the building, which isn't really what we want either. So let's go back and ask ourselves what to do. So um, it it turns out that as I said, by default, everything is just on all the time. The availability managers are scheduled to be on, and the availability schedule that's of the air handler is always on. So this guy is always on, the availability schedule. So I usually keep a section of my Grasshopper canvas, and I use this component here to pull a list of all of the different available schedules that there are. And you can search for keywords too if you want, but it's basically, I believe it's this one here. Yeah. So um, again, Mustafa and Chris have talked about this, but I made a new economizer here, and actually I'm going to use this for everything in this example. And I use these visualization tools, um, specifically this one here, and it pulls the values out for you. So if you pull that one down and plug the schedule name into it, it will show all the values. And then I plug those values into a Ladybug a 3D chart, and I got this, right? So um, it's basically showing us an availability, right, so to speak. Yeah. So, and that schedule happens to be called this. The name is not great, but um, you know, for demo purposes, I hope it's good enough. So I have a panel up here, right, and I'm going to plug that into first the availability schedule. And the availability schedule is not it's not the availability manager. What the availability schedule does is it basically does not this chart, but it does the first part of this chart, which is it forces everything. Oops, it's going to force everything that's attached to our economizer component to essentially, excuse me, it's going to everything that's attached to our air handler component to essentially shut off between these hours. Okay, it's not going to shift the mechanical system over here, or the mechanical ventilation controller. It's not going to do anything there, and it's also not going to handle the nighttime situation. But it will, or it should, just by doing that one thing, plugging in this, you know, really nice uniform schedule here that you can see shuts off very regularly at night. When we go back to our visualization, yeah, so you can see now that the outside air flow rate is much more uniform, and it's shutting off at night. Um, we also see that the economizer status is pretty much on all the time, but because but that's okay. The status has nothing to do with the flow, so it's kind of good that I actually plotted these two things separately. because even though the status is essentially, you know, on most of the time, it doesn't really matter. And then you can see our fan here is kind of controlling more regularly. And then what's even nicer is that the cooling coil appears to be working a lot more smoothly now too. I wish that I could, I had a bigger screen so I could superimpose these images on top of one another. But I think you kind of get the idea here. So, but we still don't quite have the behavior that we want, right? So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try plugging, and I think, you know what, actually, for demo purposes, it might just be easier if I turn off this lockout, because I believe that the lockout is causing the economizer to go to its minimum position more than I'd like it to. Okay, this is almost done. Okay, so I just turned off lockout, and if I reload here, yeah, okay, that's starting to look a little more uniform. So now my flow rate is a little bit more like I would expect, and you can see this is actually kind of cool. You can see how well it correlates to the outdoor dry bulb here when the lockout's off. You can see when it gets really hot outside, you can see the economizer tends to go back to its minimum position. And that correlates pretty well with when fan energy is high. And well, this isn't a great scale, but it also seems to correlate pretty well. At least you can see where the scale is a little bit better for cooling, how the economizer is responding as well. Okay, so let's go back and let's add a mechanical ventilation controller, and you can see that I've also given it the same economizer availability schedule. So this won't shift it. Let's just see if this has any material impact, really. And I'm just going to pause just to save time here. Okay, that simulation just finished. Let's go ahead and take a look at this again. Yeah, I mean, no real material impact. I'm sure that if we really drill down in and use a different visualization, it might be better. But so that's just to prove to you that there's not a huge impact there. But always know that the mechanical ventilation controller should also allow you to turn on demand controlled ventilation, which is probably the more important feature in this particular example. Okay, so now that didn't really solve the nighttime control thing, and it turns out that in order to solve the nighttime control thing, we need to use something called the availability manager list, which is a new component. You see I haven't even created an icon for it yet. And these are the values that you'll want to put in for type and control type. There's actually a lot of different types of availability managers, but OpenStudio supports two right now. One is scheduled and the other one is called night cycle. Night cycle is really the one that we're going to use, and you can see here that the type, if you plug in a 1, it will make it night cycle. And then control type is only active if the type is set to night cycle. And you'll want to set it to 1 as well, which is cycle on any. Otherwise, it's just going to stay off if you set it to 0. In other words, it's sort of stupid, but setting it to 0 doesn't let anything turn on at night. So you want to put it on cycle on any. And you want to plug this into your air handler. And I guess the way that I like to think of this conceptually is that, the air handler sits above the economizer. And so by setting the availability manager um, at the air handler level to night cycle and any, it's sort of going to listen, it's sort of going to sort of just talk to the economizer and make sure that it does the same. Now, it turns out that you could put an availability manager on the Airside Economizer. Again, I didn't want to go through every permutation in this example. I was just trying to make one thing happen. Now, if we come back to our example, um, unfortunately, this is California, so the weather here doesn't get to such a point that we'll need a lot of after hours, and so you can see here that there's just like a couple hours in the winter where it's coming on. But if I chose a different climate, which I have tested, you'll see that there's a lot more activity in the fans and the overall amount of energy being consumed at night in order to keep the building heated. So um, that's it for this time. I hope that that was helpful for you. At least it'll give you a little bit of an introduction. I'm hoping that we can get into a little bit more of an involved one next time. But, really this availability schedule and availability manager list goes a long way to giving you the behavior that you want. I really couldn't figure out for a while why these plots I was making were coming out and showing, things being on all the time when they really didn't need to be. So that's it. Good luck and happy modeling.